Well, hello again and welcome. Hello again and welcome to another day of Festival Bloomsday Montreal's online festival 2021, our 10th anniversary. We're delighted to have you here, and we're delighted this morning to have a conversation between Kerry McElroy, one of our board members, and Cian Gill, who's a podcaster in Ireland, in Cork, Ireland. It's going to be about I don't want to screw it up here. The origins of Irishness in cinema, from Joyce and silent film to John Ford and Darby O'Gill. So it's going to be great. They recorded it in advance. It's a video of 57 minutes, which we're going to have a chance to look at. And then Kerry is here, she is here. She's in the background. She's standing by, and we'll have a Q&A with Kerry. Those of you on Zoom who have registered on Zoom and are with us through the Zoom app will be able to ask questions using the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can type your questions in there, and I'll be having a look at them as we go and pose them to Kerry at the end. She's a delightful woman with a great deal to say, and honestly, this guy, Cian Gill, is out of this world. He has a podcast called Wide Atlantic Weird, which you can Google and find on the podcast. I listened to a couple last night. He's just fantastic. So it's going to be a wonderful conversation. But before we actually get started officially, I do want to make the statement that we like to say. The Montreal Bloomsday Festival would like to acknowledge that we are based on the unceded Indigenous territory of Tiohtià:ke, and that the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is the custodian of these lands and waters. That's the Mohawk Nation. First I want to say that tell you a little bit about Kerry. Kerry is a cultural historian. She's a film and cultural historian and writer with a recent doctorate from Concordia University in the PhD Humanities. Her thesis, entitled Class Acts, A Socio-Cultural History of Women, Labor, and Migration in Hollywood, focused on the actress as working class subject and included fieldwork interviews she conducted with women in Hollywood across professions. She's published articles on cinema, women, history, culture, and politics in Irish America, The Independent, and Serai, among other magazines. She holds master's degrees from Columbia and Carnegie Mellon universities. And Kerry, as she'll tell you in the podcast, is currently a kind of gypsy, a COVID-19 gypsy. She was in transit to move to another country, and she is now in Chicago, back in her parents' house. And she's working internationally, as we can do on Zoom, coaching international students around the world. And of course, her really terrific PhD thesis is in the process of finding a publisher. A little bit about Cian. He writes and hosts the Wide Atlantic Weird podcast, as I said. It's a show that takes a critical but never cynical look at strange beliefs. Recording from County Cork in Ireland, Cian takes a special interest in tales of the mysterious, weird fiction and folklore from Ireland. The show features original research, analysis, and contributions from experts in fringe thought from around the world. So it's really going to be exciting, and I'd like to get right to it now. We have Edmund, our technician, standing by to roll that video that was recorded a couple of days ago with Cian Gill and Kerry McElroy. And we'll see you again back here. The video is 57 minutes long, so sit back and enjoy.
Right, hello and welcome. It is Bloomsday Montreal. You're very, very welcome to this talk. This is Origins of Irishness in Cinema, from Joyce and silent film to John Ford and Darby O'Gill. So we have a lot of things to talk about for this one, and a lot of historical stuff, film history, a little bit of folklore, I hope, because that's the stuff I like. And yeah, we have a whole lot of different topics, and we're going to do our best to get around to most of them. So my name is Cian Gill. I'm recording here in Cork in the south of Ireland. I am the host of a podcast called Wide Atlantic Weird, which is about why people believe unusual things. And a lot of what I study tends to end up taking place around the era of Joyce, kind of like late 19th century, early 20th century. There's a lot of really interesting stuff happening with literature, with folklore, with spiritualism, theosophy, all of that stuff. And Joyce had some interesting opinions about that stuff, which we might get to. So I'm really, really interested in a lot of the social movements that were happening around this time, around the early 20th century. And with me to talk about all of this great stuff is Dr. Kerry McElroy. Would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your background?
Yes, hi. And I will tell our Bloomsday audience that Cian and I are friends, and we've also done a podcast in the past. So we are old pros. What did we do? We did
talked
some
about gross
details of North American diaspora, Irish Americanness, and Irishness, which is similar to what we're doing today, except specifically around cinema. So yes, I am Dr. Kerry McElroy as of just only several months. It still sounds funny for me to hear that. Those of you watching from Montreal will probably know me from Bloomsday. For 10 years on now, I've been involved with Bloomsday. I'm on the board at this point, but we wanted to do a discussion because I am a film and cultural historian, and we thought, how can we discuss, with Bloomsday's theme this year being origins, how can we work on kind of like the early film history of Ireland and things that people really usually don't think about, but also taking the early film history of Ireland up to the cultural history of Ireland and the connection, this constant diaspora, right? This back and forth between the US, Hollywood, Irish Americanness, Irishness. And so that's what we're going to talk about today.
Amazing. And I suppose it's worth saying that another of my interests, which shows up on my show quite often, is ideas about identity and self-identity. And that's something we talked about on the show years ago, about the construction of Irish American identity. And there's so many fascinating things there. And I think cinema is going to play a key role in our examination of how these ideas of self are created or perpetuated.
But sure, because we can't talk about it without talking about kitsch.
Hence, Darby O'Gill will be coming into the conversation a little bit later.
Darby O'Gill in the title of our talk.
I'm excited to find out how people feel about Darby O'Gill in North America, because I know how we feel about it here. So
short answer, can't live without it. Close the chat.
Short answer, kitsch. Anyway, we're going to start off with the man himself. So fantastically, Joyce shows up right in there when you talk about the beginning of Irish cinema. So let's talk a little bit about his ideas about film, cinema, and the Volta.
Well, right, and like how weird and serendipitous is it that this is a festival that was founded literally first on Ulysses, then on celebrating Joyce, and at least in its North American iterations, and around the globe too as well, it's sort of become an Irish cultural and literary festival, right? So I mean, we can't only talk about Joyce, and yet Joyce is all wrapped up in film, and Joyce is in like more than a little wrapped up in the film history of Ireland. He is a central figure somehow, so he's like this like Zelig in a way. Joyce was living in Trieste. He was already an expat. He was already famously, in his love-hate relationship with his own country. But he was involved with businessmen in Trieste, so Italian and pan-European businessmen. And he thought Ireland needed a cinema. And so in 1909, he helped to found, and he was they financed him, and he helped to found the Volta. It was on, I believe, Mary Street in Dublin. And it was not a big success. Joyce thought that it was not a big success primarily because they were showing too many European films. And that the Dublin audiences, this is very early, right? So there's already this like hankering for films, but we're in 10-minute single reels, that sort of thing. And they already wanted, there wasn't Hollywood yet, but there were American films, right? So most of the kind of exciting films were coming from the US. There was a bit of British film. And I think that with his contacts and the networks they were working in, they were mostly showing like Italian films, maybe German films, French films, and it wasn't really working. And so after about 7 months, Joyce said, enough of this, and he pulled out of it. Now, the Volta continued in different iterations of theater cinema all the way until the 1940s. Then it was torn down. It was made into a department store. And this is very much in keeping with film history in the US as well. I'm a Hollywood historian more than anything. And it's a very similar, well, it's even worse in LA. LA is like the land of discarding of history. It's an anti-history place, right? So in LA, you have all of this like film history that's priceless that was just completely destroyed. And that's been going on for decades. So it's kind of similar in a much smaller scale that people didn't really pay any attention to the Volta. People didn't consider it as like, this is the site of the first cinema in Ireland. And they didn't make the connection between Joyce and the Volta really very much either for many years. And it was only in 2007 that there's a plaque there now. So
it's a Penny's,
forgotten film history.
It's a Penny's, which is an Irish department store. It's quite big in the UK as well, where it's called Primark, right. But it's an Irish company. So right. we have a sort of a cult. There is a sort of a cult attachment to it in its own way, but again, it's a bit kitsch as well.
Yeah, but it took a long time.
The question about the Volta was, in those days, was cinema seen as a working class thing, an upper class, middle? Like when you say they showed European films, now we have this connection. Oh, that means they must be very arty and very highbrow. Was that how it was seen at the day, or was there just not enough other people making films? Was that?
Well, that's a good question, because in the U.S. and my PhD thesis was on Hollywood, and it was on American culture and American class, a lot about American culture and American class, and how film was received in the US. However, my master's thesis at Columbia was more about how film was received in the UK. So I imagine it would be similar in Ireland, which the very short answer is film was extremely working class and the highbrow culture looked down on it. So you wouldn't be a professor at Trinity and pop into the cinema. You absolutely wouldn't. It would be like going to a penny arcade with kids, like it was they called it the chambermaid's delight. Wow. So film was extremely classed in this period. When we're talking 1905, 1910, 1915, 1920, film was very classed. It was in the US, it was very much like, they called it the bug hutch, the flea pit. They were always having fires in there. You had immigrants who didn't speak English learning learning manners and mores and eating peanuts and eating fruit and peeling oranges. And I mean, it was like a considered this like pandemonium. So it was extremely classed. And when you think about, I mean, how do we think about Joyce today, right? Joyce is impenetrable. He's so highbrow that people say I can't even read him. And yet he was the founder of the first cinema. At that time, it was a little seedy. Yes,
that's what I was wondering. So
that's weird in itself, really. When you
I wonder, is that part of his kind of modernist, I'm interested in the ordinary man, which is how people interpret some of his writing.
I think it's part of his kind of, at the risk of being, I mean, a bit of genius, a bit of paradox, right? That like he was able to see beyond what other people couldn't see in a way. I mean, he was a business failure in most of his life. He never had money, but he was too smart for his own good in a way, maybe, because, I also, I don't know if you saw in some of the notes we were sharing back and forth, but like, there have been critics writing about Joyce for 100 years saying part of what makes his writing so different than other people's is its cinematic nature. And yet then we have this paradox of like, he's impossible to film in some ways. Like it's impossible to make a film version of Finnegan's Wake. People have tried. There's experimental film. There's, Ulysses. We might talk about that again in a bit. But yet part of what makes him so hard to film is that he's writing in a way that sort of mimics the way we experience cinema. And the one thing that I really noted when I went back and looked in all my research to prepare for us today is that Joyce had a lifelong bad relationship with the visual. because of his eyes, right? He was he had all these eye surgeries. He was, as a writer, it's like Mozart or someone going deaf. Like, he was a writer and yet he couldn't see, and that got worse and worse as his life went on. He had all these eye surgeries. He had a lot of pain with his eyes. And so he is literally quoted as saying, when I am laid up, when I'm laying on the sofa and I can't do anything and I have to keep my eyes closed for days and days at a time, what I see is cinema. So he was sort of like living cinema, and then that comes through in the writing. So, I mean, how amazing! Like, it's a much deeper question than just like, oh, I had a business venture and I opened a cinema.
Yeah, it makes me think of how, Impressionism was influenced by the camera, and how suddenly they would have a frame. That you could conceive of the idea of a frame and cutting things off. Or, Evelyn Waugh was a writer in the 1920s, and his writing was influenced by the telephone. He thought he was maybe the first writer in England to write these forms of dialogue where you have these like short, snappy sentences, and then a paragraph, and all that was seen as modernist. And if you think about like some scenes in Ulysses, right, where Leopold is working in the newsroom, right? And there's modern journalism, and there's the way that language is changing. And it's like the language of modernity of the typeset and the journalism and the snappy language is seeping into the way that they're living. Certainly, this new technology of cinema was seeping into Joyce's life, and then was also seeping into his writing. So there's a lot going on there. And it's deeper than, like I said, it's deeper than just like a random business venture, for sure. So another question we had in mind to talk about was about whether there were any sort of folklore or spooky tales associated with Joyce here in Ireland. And I got in touch with our mutual friend Chris Joyce, who has been involved in Bloomsday, Montreal for several years ago, but he's known. And he is, of course, a direct descendant of the man himself, as the name may suggest. And I just had a little chat with him about this. Now, Joyce, of course, was he wasn't like W.B. Yeats. He wasn't like Oscar Wilde. He wasn't interested in he was not a spiritualist, a theosophist, or anything like that. He was far more materialist than those gentlemen. And that alone is interesting to me, because I work in that era so much, and so much of Victorian and Edwardian society was informed by these spiritualist beliefs, far more than a lot of historical narratives have recorded, I think, anyway. And for him to be so not interested in that itself was interesting. And so he was, Chris reckons he was more interested in sort of earthly delights, and this is tied to his rejection of religion. And so he absolutely did have, he had spiritualist beliefs. He felt strongly against certain forms of superstition. And so I suppose he was a forward-looking guy in some ways, and maybe that leads into his interest in film as well. Although he told me he shared one story that Joyce had astrophobia, which I believe is a fear of thunder and lightning, because when he was young, his aunt told him that it was a sign of God's wrath. And Chris himself reckons he has the same affliction, so he was wondering whether it runs in the family. So small bit of superstition there on behalf of the man himself.
Well, and it sounds like what you're saying is, sometimes the most committed atheists are hiding a secret occultist streak. Like there's no a reason they're so
in foxholes, as the phrase goes. Let's move on to early Hollywood. So we're going to talk a little bit about, I like this a lot, the O'Callans. This sounds fun. Tell us about this.
Yeah. And before I go into it, would you ever have been aware of that growing up in Ireland? Like, no,
I had not heard this story before. I read a biography of Mac Sennett, and that was the extent of my kind of in-depth knowledge of sort of the Irish presence.
He comes up in my PhD thesis and my general research, which is, by the way, I should have said at the beginning, if you give an elevator pitch to a layperson, a big part of what I do is kind of a Me Tooing of Hollywood history, right? So this idea that like in 2017, the world changed and people were finally saying there's been all of these misdeeds around sexual assault and misconduct in filmic culture around the world, right? But it started with Harvey Weinstein and it started in Hollywood. And so part of what I do as a film and cultural historian is say, like, we can't just put that lens on today. you can't say Bill Cosby, Harvey Weinstein, and walk away from it. We should be putting that lens on the past, because there are a lot of women and a lot of people who were silenced, and the villains of history often won. You know, schools are named after them, awards are named after them. So that's a big part of what I'm doing, is putting the spotlight of what happened with Me Too on film history. So all to say, Max Sennett was a bad guy.
Yeah, I'm aware of this.
In that respect. Now, that was a little segue there, but we were talking about the O'Callums, and because that might come up again, because we're going to talk about Maureen O'Hara, probably John Ford. You know, this idea that we go back in film history and look at the bad and not just the good, because when we just look at the good, you end up with this celebration of kitsch, right? So we, you know, like I always thought when I was doing my PhD, when I was trying to make a little extra money, I thought maybe I'll go do those like Turner Classic Movies, like tours, you know? And I was like, they don't want me because I'm not only going to say the golden age and everything was wonderful, right? We have to look at the bad as well. Anyway, but a nicer segue is the O'Callums are a relatively positive and sunny story. I don't have any Me Too dirt on the O'Callums, really. So the O'Callums were there was a New York-based American film company called KLM, and they decided to. Well, I mean, their founders were named KLM, so they decided to call themselves Kalem, and they ended up. They were, while most of, there was a shift around between 1908, 1910, 1911, a lot of the New York-based companies, which was all of the American film industry, the very, very early, they started to move to LA. They started to move to Hollywood. They made what became Hollywood. And the Kalem company instead was doing something different that made them a bit artisanal, but really it was about cheapness. They decided to go on location. They decided to keep shooting in direct sunlight. And so they went to Egypt, they went to Palestine, they were shooting all around the world. They were the first American film company to go on location to other countries and make American film productions in other countries. So they famously went to Ireland. And so when we talk about diaspora and exchange, the first fiction film made on Irish soil was this American film. It was, if it's not The Lad from Old Ireland, that was their first big hit in 1910. I believe it's that one. But they went for 18 weeks. They made like 16 films in 18 weeks or something, and they began the Irish film industry. So they called themselves the O'Callums. The production company was a disparate group of Americans of all different ethnicity. Some of them were first generation Irish Americans, and their parents had come maybe 20, 30 years before. So there was already this diaspora. And I think we'll talk about this a bit more, certainly with like The Quiet Man. But that first film sets the tone for 100 years of films in Ireland and Irish American films about kind of going home, going back to the, you know, finding the roots, returning to the homeland, and the idea that like the boy makes good, right? So he leaves rural Ireland, he goes to New York, he makes it big. He's either a politician in New York or he's a violinist, and then he's forgotten his sweetheart back in Ireland, or he's forgotten his old mother, his saintly mother, and then he brings her to New York, and you know, it's the happy ending. So that tone was already set in 1910. And I think we were going to talk about, there's a scene in this film, the Lad from Old Ireland, 1910, where he gets off the train when he goes home because his heartstrings are pulling at him. He's made it big in New York, but he's got to go back, and he forgot the girl, and also the girl is getting evicted by the landlord. So you have the politics, right? You have like it's already present. And he gets off the train, and John Ford shot that almost shot for shot, the scene when he gets off the train, when John Wayne gets off the train, when he goes back in The Quiet Man. So it's already all there in 1910.
Direct descendant.
Yeah.
And I suppose The Quiet Man would be better remembered today amongst, you know, if people know anything about the history of Irish perception or American perceptions of Ireland through film, Quiet Man is a really important one. In this earlier film from 1910, is Ireland portrayed as rural and old-fashioned and slightly mythological in that way? Is it romanticized?
Very romanticized. They very purposely, I mean, which is not an unintelligent thing to do. They went for the location. So they landed in Cork. They were filming all over West Cork. They went into Kerry. They filmed mostly the O'Callums in this like historic early setting of film history. They filmed mostly around Killarney. But so they were looking for, you know, I mean, the most beautiful, the most picturesque shots. But they were also really interested in using the local people as extras. Sidney Alcott was the kind of director, producer, writer, leading man, one of the impresarios of the company. And he very famously said that the Irish are natural actors. There was a lot going on with them filming. There's so many charming stories in this whole thing. They were filming. There's a pub that's still open and it's still in the family, and they've got pictures of this first film company that was filming there. But they were filming I'm losing my train of thought for a second. Shoot.
So yeah, they went to all they wanted the natural beauty. They wanted the local people to be characters, I suppose, and emphasize.
Right, and so there was a famous thing that happened though, where some of the production company were pretty devout Catholics, some of them Irish Catholics, some of them other Catholics. They went to mass at the local church on a Sunday, and the priest, he was sort of an outlier because most of the community were very happy to have them there. Oh, that's what I was going to say. Some of the people that they made a point to put in these earliest silent films, some of them had lived through the famine. That's how old they were. But some of them, they were so proud to be in the film because they wanted their children and grandchildren living in New York and Boston to see them on screen.
That's lovely.
So these are 70, 80-year-old people, right? And so mostly they were very well received by the population there. And yet there's this anecdote of the parish priest gets up on a Sunday, and instead of reading the gospel and instead of giving his sermon, he says, we have these like bohemian Americans here. They're wearing makeup. They're kissing in the churchyard. We've got to get rid of them. Also, they were using them as extras playing like the British or the Black and Tans. And so he's saying our boys are selling their soul to the devil for coins, dressing up in British uniforms. And so we've got to clear these people out there. Oh, and also he was very angry that they were not showing modern Ireland, that they were romanticizing it, that they were showing the country and they were showing the people he thought they were showing them to be backward, right?
That's really interesting.
Yeah. So the crew left crying. People left the church crying, and they tried to appeal to him. They said, no, we're not here to make Ireland look bad. We're here to make Ireland look good. And he wouldn't hear it. So Sidney Alcott went to the bishop in the city, and the bishop made the priest apologize. And then the priest was relocated.
I can't emphasize enough how successful I think this world building, Ireland in the American imagination, how successful this has been. When I was growing up, travel wasn't as ubiquitous as it is now. If you met people from, especially here prior to the 90s, we weren't as globally connected, I suppose. And if you met people from America, everybody had a story about someone who knew somebody who met an American, and they knew nothing about Ireland, and they would ask, like, do you guys have electricity? Or, is it true you only have one road that goes from north to south? And like that sounds daft to us, but this is what people were fed for years, like this Blarney mythological version of things. And, it's the same way, depending where you are in the world, you grow up thinking that Africa is all elephants and people living in huts, and it's just, these cultural archetypes have a much longer half-life than the media that creates them. And and
then we get into that question again of kitsch, because someone like John Ford lived and died on that, right? He played on it, and by playing on it, he brought over American tourists who wanted to experience that version of Ireland. And then Ireland sells that version back to the American tourists as a way to, there's an entire industry of this sort of kitsch.
It's like if you go to Galway today and you're like, this is exactly what we want what the tourist board wants, North Americans to think Ireland is like. but it's become real. So like, there's
exactly.
there is musicians everywhere, and there's wonderful pubs everywhere, and Galway is great fun place to visit. But it's on the one hand,
like
it's
a
like
Disney.
yeah, it's like a Disney version of Ireland. But on the other hand, it's the most international city. Everybody there is from somewhere. Like it's full of international students. It's full of tourists, and it's a great city actually. It's tremendous fun. But it's like they've created. I mean, I thought the same thing when I went to New Orleans. It has remade itself in the manner of the legend.
It's a meta city.
Yeah, it's like you come expecting jazz in every bar. Well, we'll give it to you. And it's like, well, they are real musicians, and now that's how they make their living. And it's
and the
good.
history is like layered on layered on layered. There's a great documentary from a few years ago that I use in my research called "Dreaming the Quiet Man," and it's Same Mary Doyle, I think, is the director, and they're quoting the people who run the pub and people who live in the city where The Quiet Man was filmed. It's an entire cultural industry. The city lives and breathes and makes their money on people coming. And there's a there's a funny quote in there where they say, "Oh, the Americans, they come over here to hear us tell them lies."
But then what happens when the lies become the truth?
Yeah. Well, and you and I had talked about the great anecdote of The Quiet Man where John Ford insisted on a certain antique train, and the Irish. So there's always same with this priest, right? The priest in my story that's 40 years before. The priest wanted modern Ireland showed, and you're shaming us. You're showing us to be these backward rural people, and it's like, but that's what people want to see because it's romantic and that's what they love, right? So there's the same exact tension with John Ford because John Ford insisted on an antique steamer train in The Quiet Man, and he had like the Irish train board, I don't know what it would be called, the transportation board. He had some bureaucrats writing to him and saying, why will you not use a modern train? Why can't you let us look modern? And he said, he was kind of grumbling, and he said, well, they'll understand when all the American tourists come over next year. They want the steamer train. They don't want the modern train. Yeah. They can see the modern train in New York, right?
So that tells me that like this idea existed before the films. He was only catalyzing it. He was only focusing it. And again, there's when you have a culture where there's people have come from all over the world, and everyone feels an identity with somewhere else, you're going to get nostalgia. It's going to be huge. It's going to be a huge part. Like dreaming of an old country is going to be a huge part of your self-identity. And he knew exactly what he was doing.
He did, but he was also deeply disturbed.
Well, yes.
I wrote a piece 4 years ago for a journal called Performance Ireland, and I was trying to, again, this kind of Me Tooing of history, right? So drawing attention to the fact that like John Ford had a major complex about the fact that he was technically Irish American. His parents were from Connemara. He was one of 12 children or something, but he was born in Maine, and he was born poor in Maine in the US, and his name was Sean Aloysius Feeney, and he changed it to John Ford. His brother was an early silent film director and actor, Francis Ford. If you remember in The Quiet Man, the old man with the very long beard who jumps out of bed to see the fight, that's Francis Ford. So John Ford and Francis Ford are actually, they're Feeneys, they're from Maine, they were very poor, their parents had left Ireland. But John Ford was technically born in the US, and he hated it. And he spent his entire life pretending to speak Irish, torturing Maureen O'Hara, like stalking her there's all these stories about, he was obsessed with the fact that he was Irish when he was, he's Irish, but he's Irish American. And so this entire imaginary of him constantly going back and constantly making the romanticized Ireland was like all part of his own personal neuroses. Wow. And it really impacted a century of Hollywood Irishness. It really, really did. And Maureen O'Hara was not, she was a very smart woman. If you read Tis Herself as her autobiography, I think I forget what year it's from, but I used it a lot in this work. She was completely aware of this. She said, John's great tragedy in life and why he was basically a miserable person. He was a brilliant director, but he was very sadistic to the crew and the cast. His great tragedy in life was that he wanted to be a hero, like an Irish Republican. He wanted to be a hero in Ireland's troubles. And because he wasn't born that, he was going to be a film director and kind of give out to everybody and take it out on everyone. She really got at the kernel of his entire psychology. And he also stalked her. And, you know, she was, if you look at her image, Mary Kate Danaher in The Quiet Man, the beautiful, fiery, unattainable Irish woman, and the laconic American hero, but he's an Irish American hero. And she says he just had John Wayne do everything that he wanted to do himself, right? So that relationship of the man coming home and getting the woman, and she's got the red hair and she's in the apron and she's in the family cottage. It's all John Ford's.
Wow, his fantasy.
Yeah.
I am pleased. I think in film discussions and film fandom at the moment, there is a bit of a change over the last few years, which is kind of, we no longer accept the myth of the author or director who, you know, has to be difficult. Like, because he's a genius, he's allowed to be difficult, and he's allowed to be cruel, and he's allowed to treat actors badly. And I think for a long time there was a kind of a reverence given to like stuff. I mean, obviously you've got really, really difficult people like Polanski. We don't even need to go there. But just someone like you know, like
the one that yelled at Lily Tomlin so terribly, and it was
that sort of behavior, you know.
Yeah,
like we people used to say, well, you know, Stanley Kubrick needs to do 150 million takes until everybody breaks down in tears. And I think now we're like, nobody needs to do that. Like, he can be a genius and be a professional and treat people properly, you know?
Yeah.
And
well,
I think,
and you know, like, let's say Hitchcock, right? Hitchcock tortured his leading ladies, but which ones? The blondes, right? The icy blonde, the patrician blonde, which, by the way, that's Grace Kelly. And then in some of my work, I've talked about how the image of the Irish woman in film, in American film, went from this like super stereotypical, super racist, back to the 19th century. You know, she's the drunken cook, she's the drunken maid, she's stealing from the house, she's sort of simian in appearance, like those old caricatures from the 1800s.
Yeah, there's a lot of history there, yeah.
And then you move down several decades and you start to have the Irish ingenue, the beautiful woman, the star actress. So you go from like the drunken cook in these silent films, who's making a fool of herself. She's always, you know, she's completely uncultured. She's an absolute fool. It's a super racist stereotype. And then you're at Grace Kelly in the 1950s. And so Grace Kelly becomes a Hitchcock abused woman, right? Because she's the icy blonde. Famously, Maureen O'Hara worked with Hitchcock, and she said, he was a lovely, kind man to me. I had no problems with him. And as banal as this sounds, she had red hair.
You had red hair, yeah.
She was John Ford's Hitchcock woman.
Am I right in saying that she's still alive? I know she was up until recently.
She died about 4 or 5 years ago.
Okay.
I had just I wrote this piece, and the kind of climax of the piece when I was doing the research was that it was a meta story, because I was doing this research on the misogyny behind the John Ford and Maureen O'Hara relationship. And then towards the end of her life, she tried very hard to have a Maureen O'Hara Film Foundation funded through Ireland and getting publicity through Ireland. And like, it never really took off. It got involved with some dodgy people. The government didn't give it funding. And yet the government gave massive funding to John Ford Ireland. John Ford is not Irish. Maureen O'Hara is Irish.
And she's a national treasure in some ways. Like, when we do talk about her reverently at times, but clearly there's standards going on.
But it was part of this whole, that became like the meta thing of the entire piece, that like John Ford won in his abusiveness, because he's like, in the literature of these film foundations in Ireland, Jim Sheridan has given talks about him as a great Irish director. So he kind of won in remaking his own image, which is, you know, Liberty Valance, right? The man who shot Liberty Valance, print the legend. John Ford produced his own film. So John Ford won in remaking himself as like the Irish director. Meanwhile, Maureen O'Hara was the greatest cultural export that Ireland had in the 20th century. And then she can't get money from the government, and John Ford's foundation gets money from the government. And that became a big meta story, because I gave a talk on it, on this like aha moment as a scholar, that I had found this. And I think somebody saw my talk, and then it all got scrubbed and it all got changed on the website. So it was like one of these scholarly detective stories.
Hmm.
And meanwhile, Maureen O'Hara, she never wanted to be a Hollywood star. Hitchcock sold her. No, it wasn't Hitchcock. I'm sorry. It was someone else. It was, I can't remember who, Alexander Korda, maybe. One of these British producers sold her to Hollywood. Back then, they were bought and sold like ball players with contracts. They had no say in where they went.
It's called the old studio system, where it's like the stars were connected to studios exclusively. Is that how that worked?
Yeah, but I mean, it was like indentured servitude. It was terrible. This is a huge part of my thesis. They were the producers would make 10 times on the star. The star would get the same salary whoever they were sold to, and then the company would make all of this money, and they were making huge money off of that. So she was sold to Hollywood, and then World War II broke out, and she couldn't go home. So she was stuck there for 4 years. She never really wanted to be in LA, and then it just happened. And so
there's a wonderful video online of her speaking on an American talk show, I presume at some point in the 50s, and I can't remember, is it one of the very big names from that time? I don't want to say because I could be wrong, but the host asks her some fairly stereotypical stuff about, oh, can you do Irish dancing? Can you speak Irish? And she can speak Irish, and she does, and it's good. It's not just the few words that everybody learns. Like, she has proper good Irish.
She was good. Yeah, she was very well educated, and she had a lot to say about. That's another thing in my work, because again, this Me Tooing of history and women in film history. They called her in Hollywood, they called her frozen champagne. And they would send around, because she was a sexy woman. She was a beautiful woman, but she wouldn't play up on her sexuality, and she wouldn't do the casting couch. And there's a memo that went around in the studios that said, she is her own Hayes office, meaning she censors herself. She stands up for, and she, in other words, she used her Irish Catholic identity to play the Hollywood studio system. Anytime they asked her to do anything she didn't want to do, she said, oh, I can't do that. They said she refuses to do leg art, and she's frozen champagne. She is her own Hayes office. And when she's asked to do something that she doesn't want to do, she says, oh, I can't do that. My ma'am in Dublin would say I turned out all bad if I did that. So she got away. In other words, she navigated this terrible system of abuse of women by playing up on her Irishness all the time. And it worked very well for her. So she was quite shrewd, and she was sort of a Me Too heroine in that way. And she talked about it. She knew exactly what she was doing.
Is there anything else worth mentioning about The Quiet Man? Because it's such a prominent, in terms of like shaping of Irish American identity and stuff like that. I
think, we talked about that train.
Yeah, I like that story. For me, that kind of sums up the whole spirit.
The whole thing.
What a blunt way to say it. I am doing this for the tourism.
Yeah.
I am creating a myth for you.
Yeah. Very self-conscious.
Yeah.
And I already did mention, Dreaming the Quiet Man is a great documentary for people to watch if they're interested in the meta history of the film, and how, by going there and filming it, they made a little industry in that area that continues to this day.
Let's talk about the Film Company of Ireland. So 1916 until 1922, some interesting stuff going on in the country at that time.
Also interesting dates. What a time to found a film company. Surprised it didn't work out. When I was doing my research to get ready for this talk, and just in general, and I realized this is kind of going back to one of our central assertions from the very beginning. The history of Irish cinema for a very long time was really American cinema of Ireland filtered through American eyes, because that O'Callum company and these first films filmed in Ireland were already American. And so when Irish film companies struggled to get off the ground, they already kind of couldn't make a dent in some ways. So the first real Irish studio isn't founded, I think, until 1958 in Bray. I think it's Ardmore.
That's right.
And so you see a similar thing, because I've taught Quebec film history, right? And living in Montreal and being in Canada. And you see a very similar thing in Canada, where you have and to some extent to the UK. They did have film companies, but film was always the little impoverished stepchild of Hollywood. Hollywood was such a juggernaut by 1915, 1920 that and it's back to what we said about the Volta. People in these countries, in Canada, in Australia, in the UK, in Ireland, they wanted the American films. So when companies would try to do it themselves, they would kind of usually fold. They didn't have the funding, they didn't have the money, they didn't have the visibility. People had, like, the 20th century really belonged to Hollywood in the global context.
We think of that as being a more contemporary phenomenon, you know, like countries that are worried about their cultural erosion because of the prominence of, you know, Hollywood, prominence of English, prominence of Anglophone culture in general. But man, it goes back so long.
If anything, I think it's changing. It's getting better, honestly.
Yeah, and then you have some countries like, you know, France and Quebec as well, who, you know, have rules about how many local films you have to show and you know, how much French language filming you have to show and stuff like that.
Yeah, well, in other words, I mean, yeah, because I mean, the countries that preserved or built their own film industries that lasted, it was because they had these strong protections. Countries that didn't have strong protections were kind of swallowed up by Hollywood, and Ireland, I read that, I think, was one of them.
I think during the war, or around 30s, 40s, in France and Belgium, they stopped allowing American comic books in, which is why they then developed their own independent comic book industry, which is now world renowned and it's quite different to North American comics, which is fascinating. That was because of restrictions, but there was a hunger for it. So people, let's I was thinking about so you know, you said the change in depiction of Irish women, particularly in film, and how it starts off from this kind of caricature, which makes me think of like the way the Irish are portrayed in like Victorian British publications, which is like bestial and dangerous and slovenly, and then that changes. Like, is it changing because the actual prominence of Irish Americans in American culture, they're rising. They're going from, you know, people at the bottom of the heap socially. They're an immigrant group who have nothing, and then they become powerful in, you know, to some degree in Hollywood, in crime families, to be fair, and eventually in politics by the middle of the century. You
crime
know,
families who turned into political.
Yes, sure enough, their depiction in media, it starts to look a bit rosier.
Absolutely. I mean, there's been a lot of documentaries that say this pretty elegantly, to the point where it's pretty accepted now. But like the story of the Irish in America is the story of kind of, I mean, in American context, it's different. And then in European context, we have to talk about whiteness, right? So the Irish become white, and they become from the lower class, like we were just saying, violent, you know, considered violent, drunken, every stereotype in the book, to a kind of, you know, the working class, the laborers who build the country, up to this lace curtain idea in the middle class, and then to aspirational and becoming part of the country's power structure. And I actually wrote a piece on that during the Trump years about how many, this is nothing to do with film, but it is to do with this cultural history and this hierarchical thing, that there were a lot of people in the Trump administration with Irish American names, and how that was a black mark on Irishness in the US, considering that you are the immigrants and you have come from, you know. So I was kind of querying becoming collaborators in a way, when part of the Irish American history has always, or part of the Irish American self-told tale has been to play up the heroism of the immigrant experience, and now you are turning around and taking part in this. And
I think it's been so successful that it's actually strange to go back and read older history, when groups like the Irish and groups like the Italians and basically Catholic and Southern people from Southern European countries were considered to be racially kind of different in the 19th century. And
100%, right.
This, like, that was so foreign to me, that as a concept, because we never think about it now. Like, those groups have so successfully integrated themselves in that the idea that they would ever be considered outsiders is just they've been so successful at creating that identity, and that history just feels weird and strange. We did an episode about, you know, notions of American identity and like Viking history and the Scandinavian stuff, and the fights that used to happen between groups of you know, people descended from the Scandinavian countries and people descended from the Catholic countries was immense. And every time, you know, there was a celebration about Columbus, there'd be fights. Every time there was a celebration about Leif Erikson, there'd be fights, especially in the big eastern cities.
Well, and remember, that's a nice segue into one of the films I wanted to talk about, even though he's not Irish at all, but he has these love letter films to Ireland, and Irish Americanness is Scorsese.
Yes.
And if you watch Gangs of New York, I mean, Gangs of New York was based on a very obscure, the guy's name is Herbert Asbury. It's from 1922. It's like a very obscure social history book. And then for whatever reason, I should look into it more because I love Scorsese. I'm like the only feminist film historian who loves Scorsese. I have a lot to say about him. I also think it's partly because his primary collaborator is a woman. And so he has like a different sensibility than a typical gangster movie. But so Scorsese wanted to make a film about that, you know, the 1850s in New York and these like hyper violent gang wars, right? And so the Irish are banding together with the Free Blacks and fighting against the WASPs and the Know Nothings and the Whigs. And so the history of who is white, who is an ascendant ethnic group in the US has always been there, of course. And but not to loop around too much, but you know, then you have Scorsese making The Departed, right?
Yeah,
so like
let's
The
talk about,
Departed
like,
is based on a South Korean film.
Yes.
It's a police procedural. And so for Scorsese to set it in Boston Irish culture, like, to me, it's genius. That's a film I can watch. I could watch it every day the rest of my life. I love it.
I'm just thinking about the place of the Irish American in the Irish imagination, which is huge, you know. And yes,
That's
The
what I
Departed,
wanted to ask.
the Departed, stuff like The Departed, like stuff like Dropkick Murphys is huge. Like, they're considered a bit kitsch, to be fair, but you know, there's one time of the year when you're going to pull out, shipping up to Boston at least, and a lot of the, you know, McNulty from The Wire, he was a bit of a cult figure here for a few years. So this concept and the Pogues, you know, with Fairy Tale of New York, which they deliberately said none of them had ever been there, and Shane McGowan basically said, this is an imaginary New York, Irish American of my imagination.
Oh, I did not know that. That's
specifically
amazing.
mentioned the film Once Upon a Time in America, which again is more about Italian Americans, but I think those groups, you know, see their story in similar ways. We were the immigrants. We came over. We made ourselves good.
Yeah.
We ascended.
Well, and I mean, you too has made a career of that as well. And then Bono lives in New York and you know, half the time. And the film In America, which came out right after 9/11, is kind of the story of Fairy
That film
Tale of New
Brooklyn
York.
recently. That's a huge one. That's the one with Saoirse Ronan, and she goes to she immigrates in the 1950s. So we have all these. I mean, immigration is what we do. Like, it's our thing. It's our release valve. When people are being cynical about the government, they say, oh, you know, they don't try and fix things. They just assume that a few thousand young people will go somewhere else, because historically there have been waves and waves and waves of that happening. So we like these narratives where we go somewhere.
And I was thinking when we were getting ready to talk today, I was thinking about like queer cinema in Ireland, or like non-white or non-native Irish cinema in Ireland. You know, is there a Nigerian film festival now? Is there a Polish film festival? And from what I was looking at, not so much yet. There's a queer cinema scene in Ireland, but there's not really a non-Irish cinema scene in Ireland. And I think Ireland really has not yet contended with its 100 years of being the emigre country, that now it's a country that people come to from other places. And what is their experience in Ireland? You know, a Polish film in Dublin, a Nigerian film in Dublin. What will that look like? And maybe it's happening and I haven't found it, but
there's a musical called Once, about a
right.
musician who meets a Polish partner, and there's a certain amount of that is like when that came out, everybody would have watched that and say, oh yeah, there's loads of Polish people living in Ireland. This is a fairly typical experience. This is a fairly typical story.
The Guard as well has.
We're getting there. I think it's fair to say we had no immigration in large numbers probably until the 1990s.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's not that terribly long for us to have decided, what does this mean? How do we feel about it?
Well, and it's like this whole conversation we're having, right? Like, in the meantime, you've still got the Irish Americans coming over and wanting the Quiet Man experience.
Yeah.
I had a family member who went, you know, the Great Return, right? The nostalgic return as the Irish American, you know, you're dreaming of going back to Ireland, even though you've never actually been there. It's, you know, it's a very stereotypical thing. And they were in the West, like somewhere in the West at like a big house type, you know, where they do like a banquet or something. And they were shocked that there were people there who were not Irish. Like some of the workers were African, or they were from other parts of Europe. And they were like, we thought we were getting, like this isn't the experience we thought we were getting. So.
And it's been long enough now. It's been 30 years. A lot of these people are Irish. They're Irish and something else, or they're, they sound like me and they went to school like I did, and we're that stuff changes. And
and it's the ghost of John Ford that's hanging.
I'm just looking at the time. We've promised that we'll talk about Darby O'Gill, and we've only a few minutes to do so.
Okay, yeah. So
we should definitely do that.
Yeah, I think you have the better anecdote about Darby O'Gill, but which is fascinating to me, just as like I love, I'm a writer.
It is absolutely considered kitsch by us. It's the height of like that sort of thing we're uncomfortable with, where it's high Blarney, it's diddly eye Ireland, which is like the worst kind, and it's
also Sean Connery.
Yeah, it's the epitome of what we think of like America doing Ireland badly. If you go back and watch it with a charitable eye, there's some interesting stuff in there, and like Walt Disney himself went to Dublin and like hit up the libraries and museums and researched folklore, and or so he said, and got in touch with Shanakees, who are traditional storytellers, and some of that stuff makes it into the film. And I think the most effective bit of folklore in there, which is genuinely interesting, is the death coach towards the end, which I came across an actual example of quite recently up in North Cork, and there was a road outside a friend's house. I was staying in the countryside, and by all accounts, there's a story associated with it that the death coach goes up and down this road, and it's a legendary ghostly spectral coach that there's lots of different versions of this, but in some versions it's more like the banshee. It appears before a death, and it's an omen. In other versions, it comes to take away the soul of the departed to hell or to heaven or whatnot. But frequently there are mentions that either the horse is headless, or the horseman is headless, or the passengers inside are seen to be headless. Mm-hmm. Which on the one hand, it's like 50-50 kind of elements of old-fashioned Irish Celtic folklore, but also 50-50 kind of more English ghost story traditions. The Headless Horseman reminds me of Borley Rectory and other classic English ghost stories.
And in the Disney, in the Darby O'Gill, they do that with a very primitive special effect from the 50s, right? So I think if I'm not mistaken, they are headless, and so is the coachman, I believe.
I will say the special effects used for the actual the leprechauns and the small people is very well done. It's what's called forced perspective, which is basically you have somebody up close to the camera and then you have somebody far away, and then you do some trickery with the lens where you have them both in focus, so it looks like they're standing next to each other. It's very clever.
By the way, I will give myself 10 points for full Irish American plastic pattyism in that. I am currently visiting my parents in Chicago, which is the south side of Chicago, which is the height of Irish kitsch. Matt Damon, Ben Affleck, the town, it's all that. And the dog that we have here is named Darby.
Oh no.
So if you ask my mother if Darby O'Gill is a classic or not, I think she would answer that it is. So
I think we're coming to the end of our time, Kerry. Are there any kind of take-home messages for people? Like, what if we were to sum some of these ideas up? What?
When we started, we were talking about Joyce, and because it is a Joyce festival, and we were talking about sort of, is Joyce filmable or unfilmable? And there are some very interesting experimental attempts at Ulysses. There's one at Finnegan's Wake, which actually holds up quite well. But I mean, because you would think, well, they're just reading from it, right? Because but it's made by one of the first American women experimental directors, Mary Ann Butte, I forget. And it holds up pretty well. I would have thought, I'm not a big one for experimental film generally. So when I tried to watch a bit to prepare for us talking today, I thought, oh, how could you film Finnegan's Wake, right? Like, unless you're standing there reading from it. But it actually works well because it's filmed like a dream, and that is what it is. And so now we're right back to that idea of, Joyce in the cinematic. It's almost like he's so cinematic that it's hard to put it on screen, if that's a paradox that makes sense. So I would say to our audience, if people are intimidated by or find impenetrable filmic versions of Joyce First of all, the Dubliners films, they are a little easier to watch because they have more of a standard narrative, right? Portrait of the Artist, there's a film version that works well. There's a 2003 film called Bloom that kind of takes Ulysses and makes it more digestible as a filmic version. If you're not into 2-hour experimental films that look like montage and stream of consciousness. But I think that there are quite a few good documentaries about Joyce as well that I think are really interesting. I have always loved, this is a book, but the story of Lucia Joyce and To Dance in the Wake. But there's some films about Joyce and women and women in Joyce. And obviously like his years living in Trieste, his years writing Ulysses. I mean, there's certainly a wealth of documentaries. So if people, I think there are filmic versions of Joyce stories that hold up and they do well, but you can also go the documentary route. That's a little more accessible as well, because the life is so interesting, of course, and the writing process as well.
Lovely. And can you say the name of your article again about John Ford so that folks could check it out?
It's called How is Herself's Mood Today?
Oh, I like that.
That's the title. I forget the subtitle. It's something like a case study in directorial sadism and Irish performative masculinity. Something like that. It's all about how Ford's like we talked about already, how Ford's personal neuroses impacted the way he directed women, the way he directed Ireland, and the way he wanted to portray himself in the world.
Fascinating stuff. We have covered a lot of ground.
We have.
Wonderful. I suppose we'll leave it at that, just keeping the time in mind. So once again, huge thanks to yourself, Kerry, for speaking with us, and big thanks to anyone who's watching at home. And
thank you for doing it.
Yeah, I'm
we
glad
have
to
an
be
Irish
involved.
presence in Bloomsday, Montreal this year. I think we might have a few other Irish people, but this one makes it an international production for sure.
I'm very proud to be involved.
Thank you.
Okay, and we shall leave it there.
Well, hello. Thank you very much, Kerry and Cian. That was just terrific. I am thrilled and much better informed than I was an hour ago. So thanks very much for all of that. I don't know, am I on screen? I guess I am. I can't see myself on screen, but I guess I'm there. Zoom's a bit of a mystery to all of us. So thanks again, Kerry. I wanted to say, as you were talking, years and years ago, I worked on a documentary. I did the narration for a documentary called Alice Guy, Le Jardin Oublié, which was about Alice Guy Blaché, one of the first filmmakers, who, as so many of these filmmakers, she got married to this guy named Blaché, and then everybody assumed that Blaché was the guy who was the filmmaker. But the story is that she was the first person to actually have a scripted film. She was working with the Gaumont brothers in Paris, and then she ended up in Flushing, New York, or New Jersey, wherever it is. I don't know that part of the world very well, where they had the first studios, and then a couple of years later they moved out to California because, as you say, because of the light. It didn't rain so much, and the light was fantastic. So that was much better. And then she was forgotten. Her work was attributed to others. It was, destroyed. She's being rediscovered. And, every 10 or 15 years, somebody else says, oh my goodness, nobody's ever heard of this person. So they rediscover her. So that's Alice Guy Blaché, really worth looking into. And I wanted to ask you, there was a film that was shot here, shot in Ireland, that really corresponds to that story that you and Cian were talking about, called Love and Savagery, that was produced in 2009, directed by John N. Smith and produced by Kevin Tierney. It was shot in Ireland. It was set in 1969, a similar story with a geologist from Newfoundland going over to Ireland and meeting this young woman who is destined for the convent. Yeah. And he falls in love with her and tries to convince her to whatever. I don't actually remember what the upshot of it was, but it was a beautifully shot film, but really very, very much in that vein. So that's fascinating. I know one of the questions that was asked, Kerry, was about horror films, and you said you didn't actually touch on that very much, because that was one of the first themes that we had discussed months ago when we were talking about what we were going to do for Bloomsday Montreal, this 10th anniversary thing. So do you want to talk a little bit about that? I know you didn't touch on it, but
hi everyone. So let me go back a step. Not related exactly to our talk, but yeah, Alice Guy Blaché, she comes up a lot. I mean, she's fascinating, right? And she comes up all the time if you're in the kind of circuits of feminist film history. Like you say, she's always sort of being forgotten and rediscovered because she was so written out of film history, you know. And I go back and I do tons of work on memoirs, and she was very well aware of how she had been written out of film history. She was quite bitter about it. Love and Savagery, we had some, you know, we had so much to talk about. We only touched on 20% of what we prepared. That's how it goes usually when you have a lot to say, and we both had a lot to say. But I had wanted to I have looked more into, like, when you have the culture of the Maritimes, right? And the deep Irish culture down to accent and music and everything. And like, why isn't there sort of more Irish film from Newfoundland? And that goes back to this point that I was making about, you know, a century of film and just the financial realities, is that people need a lot of money to make films. And when Hollywood is the behemoth that eats everything up, you know, if everybody who had a story to tell about the Irish roots of Atlantic Canada could make a film, we'd have a lot more of those films, but we don't have so many. So this like exchange when it is there is so interesting. And I would suspect that, you know, look at this, we're doing talks on Zoom. Things are becoming democratized with media, right? Everybody can make a film. There are great young filmmakers making films on their iPhones. So I suspect you'll see more stories that were shut out for 100 years when Hollywood decided what Irishness looked like. Hollywood decided what Irish cinema looks like. And then to your last point, to segue to horror, we didn't talk about horror because I don't really know much about Irish horror. I don't think there is a lot of Irish horror, because everybody who would have, I mean, and you know, we could get an expert in here who would know better than me, but it goes back to what I was saying, that the public hunger for films would have been, you know, if you were going to the cinema in 1940, 1950, 1970, 1990 in Ireland, you know, you just pop down the street in Dublin and you see what's on at the local cinema. If you want to see a horror film, it's going to be the same ones they're watching in the US. They're, you know, so it's Freddy Krueger and everything. I wish Cian was here for that, because he could tell you about an Irish childhood in, let's say, the 80s and 90s or something, of what they would have seen for horror. But as far as I know, with all my Irish friends, they would have the same cultural references that we would on this side. I think that's my answer.
Yeah. Well, of course, I mean, Hollywood is so dominant, and because of the budgets and the possibility of doing all those special effects, I have seen kind of homemade horror films, and boy, they're interesting.
Well, and there's a big tradition of British horror as well, like the Hammer films and everything. So I think it would just be an international scene.
Sure. Great. So let's have a look at some of these other questions that are coming in. Well, there was, you actually answered a couple of them privately to the questioner, but somebody wanted to know what was the name in the town with the pub with photos that celebrates the film company visit in Ireland?
Yeah, it's called the Beaumont Bar. It's still there. It's got a lot of memorabilia from these first film productions. It's still in the same family. I don't know if their name is Beaumont. I believe maybe that's why, but it's in Killarney in Kerry.
Okay, great. And your name for that. So there you go.
I am. Not the bar, just the county.
Yeah, Kerry and Darby all in the same house.
Oh my goodness, could it be any more? Could we overdo it a bit more?
Yeah. And one of the other questions was about the department store that Cian mentioned. Pennies?
Pennies. Yeah. And, you know, we used to have, I don't know if anybody would know this in Montreal, but here, I'm in Chicago right now and I'm reconnecting with my own roots. There used to be J.C. Penney's here. I'm not sure if that's the same. They went out of business here. So I don't know if anybody would know that. But when I was growing up, there was J.C. Penney's here, and that might be the same Pennies of the Irish family, or I don't know. Again, that Cian could tell us about pennies in Ireland? Because I don't know it.
Right. Well, I certainly remember J.C. Penney's. They don't exist in Canada.
Yeah, they're gone. They're gone.
No, they never did. But I used to go down and buy cheap underwear in Plattsburgh at J.C. Penney's and smuggle it across the border. So there you go. My little secrets. I can't do that anymore because we can't get across the border, and the dollar is in the toilet. The Canadian dollar is in the toilet at the moment. So there you go. I also wanted to ask about, well, you were talking towards the end about how the Irish moved up from, being down upon, no dogs, no Irish, which really did exist. There were signs like that. The Irish could not get hired. I could not get hired at Morgan's department store as a sales girl. The moment I put down my name and they asked your religion at the time, this was, of course, I'm very old, right? So this was in the 60s. I put down my name and that I was Catholic, and they said, "Thank you very much."
Oh my God! Imagine being able to ask a religion on a.
Yeah. Well, things fortunately have changed. Anyway, I was thinking about Joseph Kennedy, who certainly moved up from being lace curtain Irish. And then, of course, he had this long affair with Gloria Swanson. So this big connection. He sponsored some of her films. Did he back some of her films?
He did, yeah.
And he was a bit of a.
Well, and that's a really good example. Cian and I kind of laughed and alluded to that, right? Like, if you look at the history of the Kennedys in the U.S., it starts with Boston politics, local politics, very successful local politics. But then there's this current of bootlegging, crime. There's a real Gatsby thing to the early Kennedys, like the every great fortune is built on a crime and all that. I mean, it doesn't come from nowhere for sure. So it's how many generations does it take to become the iconic American family, and then we kind of forget about the crime part.
Right.
But that's what I meant to say with that. Being involved with film at that point was not so prestigious. It was a way for a businessman who's kind of on the make to make money, just same as do a little bootlegging, do a little film producing. It wasn't this highbrow stuff. And that was the point I was making as well before about the Nickelodeon and who was going to see films and stuff. So him being involved with a star was not it is not as glamorous as it would be 50 years later, perhaps.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah. All right, and I wanted to mention John Huston's The Dead. I don't know, I'm sure we've got some people on here who saw our concert last year, and I wanted to mention that during the concert, we had a Zoom bomb by a fabulous Irish entertainer named Carmel O'Reilly, who was at the time stuck on a cruise ship. You remember that cruise ships couldn't get back to land. Yeah. So here she was in June, stuck on a cruise ship, and she had been entertaining the crew and the passengers who really intended to be there for 2 weeks for the past 4 months with what she calls her sham roguery. They were pretty fed up with it. So it just so happened that while we were having the concert, she was in her cabin trying to get onto the internet, and she found us, and here we were. So she photobombed, or Zoom bombed, I should say, came on and told us this crazy story about auditioning for John Huston when he was in Dublin auditioning for The Dead. And she thought she did the best audition possible, but John Ford didn't agree. And she is of the opinion that John Ford really missed an opportunity. He would have, his film of The Dead would have been much better
if
otherwise.
She was in it.
Yeah.
That is a good film.
But, oh, well, yes, of course. And yesterday, everything's tied together. We had John McCourt on as part of the academic panels, and he was going on and on about how the city of Dublin has now given a permit to some developer to take the house, I don't know the address, the house that was filmed, that was The Dead, and turn it into a hostel. So demolish the entire interior and turn it into a hostel, not even a homeless shelter, but just a hostel for anybody who can't afford a hotel. And he said, it's absolutely nuts. At the moment, all the hotels are empty. The B&Bs are empty. And these, a huge petition from all kinds of writers all around the world, wrote to the Irish government, wrote to the mayor of Dublin to say, you've got to stop this. And they were completely ignored. So this iconic building of Joyce Sienna is going to be just gutted and turned into a hostel. So it's really awful, just awful. And then somebody else asked, well, what about this business of repatriating Joyce's remains, because he's buried in Zurich? And John was like, look, they're not even prepared to turn this building, this iconic building, into a historic museum or something, but they're going on about repatriating his remains. Give me a break. Well, those weren't his words, but that was his sentiment. So if anybody's interested in writing to the Irish government or to the mayor of Dublin about preserving that building, please go right ahead, because I don't think the fight is over yet. I think Bloomsday Montreal can take it under their wing and see what we can do to make sure the Irish government fully respects whatever they can of the history of James Joyce, because they're earning money off him. So, put your money where your mouth is. That's my diatribe for now. Let's have a look now. I've got a mention from Colleen Curran. Well, Colleen Curran, who could she be? My sister and I had the record and an LP of Darby O'Gill and Little People, and have listened to it countless times until we actually saw the movie. So
I'm surprised I did not have that. I've seen the movie many, many times in my life, but I don't think we had the record.
I have never seen either one. My Irish films is Waking Ned Divine. I could watch that. I could watch that over and over again.
Darby O'Gill, it's Disney. It's 1960, if I'm not mistaken, or 59, and it's as Cian was saying, incredibly kitsch.
Yeah.
But kind of cute, kind of charming. It's worth it. It's a bit of fun, especially like this mid-century American portrayal of real old Ireland. It's a lot, like Cian said. Hi, Blarney.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Well, I certainly have to look into it. And there's just a huge list, as he was talking about once. The Irish, the new immigrants to Ireland. That was really fascinating to think about. Ireland sees itself still as an exporter of people,
right,
and is slow to admit that they are bringing people in. And of course, the newcomers are treated badly, the way newcomers always are. I have to think it's not dissimilar, since I'm in the film industry myself, as what goes on here in Quebec. The Irish, the English, everybody, this has been a melting pot since the very beginning. And yet there's this, you see television shows, there's a lot of local television production, and it's supposed to be set here in Montreal, and nobody speaks any language other than French. It's not that they couldn't, they're all just Québécois, vieille souche. If there's an Anglophone, well, it's really unusual. There's like one Anglophone. And I've had to play those parts. And usually it's, making fun of la grosse anglaise. Yeah. So I get to play la grosse anglaise. And I don't get to speak French as well as I can, because they want me to have an accent un peu bizarre.
Right.
It's just really, really strange that's what happens. And I've worked on documentaries where, they make a big fuss about recent immigration from South America, because those are Latin people. So they're more acceptable. But it's tough. It's tough. When you're feeling threatened, when you're feeling culturally threatened, to open your heart and open your society to new people. It's quite an interesting process, and I'm sure that it's going to get more open. But it's really interesting.
Well, I think there's always a big connection, certainly in Quebec and in Ireland as well, and think about even the U.S. When the cultural imaginary goes to the hyper traditional, and that there's one type of person in that country, it tends towards the right wing, right? It's a remembrance of when the country was pure, and there's no such thing. There's no such thing in Dublin. There's no such thing in New York. There's no such thing in Montreal.
That's right. And I remember years and years ago, Rita Deverell, who was a host on Vision TV for many years, she auditioned for a part. She was an actress. She auditioned for a part in a Western that was set in Western Canada. And they said, well, I'm sorry, there were no Black settlers. And no, there were.
Of course.
There were, but completely forgotten.
Right, of course.
So, there's this huge whitewashing everywhere. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting. We're at the cusp of change in so many areas. And as you say, Kerry, the fact that people are making their own films on their iPhones, it's transformative.
Right.
The technology that we're using today is absolutely transformative. Here we are. You're in Chicago. I'm in Montreal. We don't know where our audience are. A lot of them are here in Montreal. Right. Cian is in Ireland. Yesterday we had people who were in one of our presenters was in Denmark. One was in England. One was in Argentina. It's mind blowing. It's really, really mind blowing. So huge changes. What else did I want to say? Oh yeah, you mentioned the lad from Old Ireland. Are these films can we find them on Netflix?
It's super interesting. No, definitely not Netflix. This is real hardcore film historian archival stuff, like museums and things like that. But the lad from Old Ireland, I want to say that's the O'Callum film that there was one, for example, this is if you're a film historian, it's the story of your dreams. These sort of things happen over and over. Most people know, if they know anything about early film history, something like 90% of silent film was destroyed because of the material that it was built on or made out of, So things burned or they were recycled. There was no sense of history about early film because it was not considered anything worth saving, right? So they're always finding things in strange archives that they would never expect, right? So they found in 2011, they found the only print of one of these O'Callum Ireland films, a German version in Germany, or German subtitles.
Right.
Because it was silent. So things like that are always happening. Things are lost. They're considered gone forever. And then they'll find one print in Argentina, or they'll find one print in Korea or something. That's always happening. So some of these films have been refound. A few of them have never been lost. And most of them, the majority of them though, were gone. So it's, you can dig them up. You can watch clips. Just like I said, Dreaming the Quiet Man is a great documentary if people are interested. There's a film by Peter Flynn, who's a professor at Emerson in Boston. He's Irish originally, but he teaches in the US. He made a documentary about the O'Callums called Blazing the Trail. So if anybody wants to learn more about this, there's a lot of the things I talked about also come up in that documentary.
I wonder what we should, maybe we should talk once this whole crazy festival is over, and you could prepare a little reading list or something like that we could put on our website.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good idea.
To find out books, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I think people would be very interested. I'm just looking here. What have we got? Lots of people saying, thank you very much. This is interesting. Well, I certainly can't deny that. I've got somebody from Chelsea, New York. That's great.
Mm-hmm.
And Colleen Curran has another Darby O'Gill reference. It was his part in a 1959 Leprechaun movie that helped land Sean Connery the role of Bond. Broccoli, the producer of the Bond films, asked his wife Diana to see if she thought Sean Connery had sex appeal. I saw that face and the way he moved and talked, and I said, "Cubby, he's fabulous." Well,
he's pretty attractive in Darby O'Gill. He's the handsome young leading man. He's the daughter's love interest, and he was quite new, but as Miles said, he took off the Scottish and put on the Irish accent in it, and it's not the best, but he gets away with it because he's so good looking.
Well, there's people are a little more careful about accents these days, but we still remember Dick Van Dyke with his Cockney, right?
Yeah, a classic, another classic from the 60s. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's a very important part of film now is having dialogue coaches, and there are people who get trained and are just brilliant. I've worked with a couple doing a video game. They have to invent sort of languages, or there's what was it, Assassin's Creed Origins. So they were sort of inventing what ancient Egyptian would sound like if spoken in English. And then there was ancient Egyptian, and then there was ancient something else and ancient something else. And so I had to play 3 different characters. And so I had to have 3 different sort of approaches to the accent. It was and I think I've got a good year. Turns out, not so much.
Well, that reminds me that like we were talking about, or Cian and I were going to talk about. So if anybody's ever seen Peaky Blinders, right? Peaky Blinders is Irish gangsters in the 1920s, but living in the north of England. And I know people who've tried to watch it who are either European or Quebecois, and English is not their first language, and it's almost impossible to them. So this pull towards kitsch sometimes is also just like simply, if you're too authentic, sometimes it's not accessible to people. You really have to almost know Irish people or English people to watch that show and catch all the slang and keep up with the accent. So this is kind of like the generic Hollywood Irish accent that Irish people like to make fun of. There was a practical reason for it for many years as well, because just the untrained ear, the deep dialect can be difficult in an international context. So Peaky Blinders is a great show, but I've literally watched it with people who are like, I need the subtitles.
Right. Well, that's certainly the case. And, we've got so many accents even here in Canada. People know about the Newfoundland accent. There are a variety of Newfoundland accents depending on what part of Newfoundland you're from.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the accent from the North Shore of Quebec,
Mm-hmm.
where they have these isolated English-speaking communities.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember seeing Ron James performing on stage in Vancouver, and he came on. He spoke, kind of normal English with a bit of an accent, and then he launched into speaking the language that he grew up in with, which is English, but with this virtually incomprehensible accent. It was phenomenal. I had no idea. So,
I love accents. And I notice every single day that I'm here and not in Montreal, my A gets a little more Chicago. So I'm my A, there's a Chicago A that I lost for years of doing my PhD and living in Montreal. And each day that I'm back here, it's just deet, 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 deet. So by the time I get back to Europe or back to Canada, I think my Chicago will trend back down, but
yeah,
how I'm there.
Well, I hope that you will be able to move on. I know you're safe and secure and well cared for by your mom, and you've got your dog and
Darby.
That stuff, Darby.
Yeah.
I know you're still missing your cat, huh?
A little bit, yeah, but he's also doing well there and
Oh,
back with you guys.
Good. Well, I think, is there anything else you'd like to say to wrap this up, Kerry?
No, if anybody wants any follow-up that we didn't get to today on like films or that we talked about or trivia, years, anything like that, I'm sure you can reach us through Bloomsday, and I'm happy to share any of that stuff. I do have a lot of useful and useless trivia on film and cultural history. So if anybody wants more information on anything, I'm happy to share it, but we can wrap it up for today, and they can get in touch with us later if that comes up.
Super. And we will eventually be able to read your PhD thesis in book form, right?
Yes, we're getting there.
Good, great. That's fantastic. Well, thank you again, Kerry.
Thank you.
Thanks to Cian. And well, thank you very much to our audience as well. We have another 2 events today. At 2 o'clock, Dennis Trudeau is going to be talking with Anne Lewis. Anne is a former journalist, an award-winning journalist, and she is now a life coach, and she is a writer and a painter. And she has written, well, she's writing all the time, as writers do, but she's written a memoir of her experience with Leonard Cohen, an encounter with Leonard Cohen, and it's going to be published by Simon & Schuster in 2023. So she'll be talking to Dennis about that and some of her other work. That's at 2 o'clock. And then at 5:30, we have a cooking lesson. Jonathan Chung from Appetite for Books is going to be baking soda bread. And Louise Cochon, our treasurer, who is a good friend of Jonathan's, will be hosting that event. And come along. The list of ingredients is on our website, so it's not too late to go out and buy that flour and heat up your oven to 425. The ingredients and the ingredients and the equipment that you need are on our website. And if you register, we will send you the recipe. But you don't really need the recipe because Jonathan's going to show you how to do it. So you can bake along with Jonathan. And my idea is if you start baking if you start putting the stuff together at 5:30, it'll be all assembled by 6:15. put it in the oven, bake it for 30 minutes, cool it for 15 minutes, and you can have it for dinner. And if there's any leftover, which is unlikely, you can have some for breakfast for toast. So that's today, and tomorrow, of course, we have the readings from the great book itself, starting at 11. Kevin Wright, our president and Joycean extraordinaire, will be hosting 6 readers reading from 6 different sections of the book. And that goes to 11 to 1:10. It's all very precise. And then at 1 o'clock, we're back with Molly Bloom's Reverie. I will be reading excerpts from that. As those of you who know the book know, it would take 5 hours to read the whole thing. And I don't want to do that, and nobody wants to listen to it. So I'm going to be reading excerpts from Molly Bloom's Reverie, and Geraldina Mendez will be playing the piano, not as an accompaniment because our technology doesn't allow that, but she'll be playing a couple of pieces that are relevant to Joyce, relevant to Molly, relevant to Ulysses, and she's a wonderful pianist. So it's going to be a wonderful afternoon, and we hope we'll see you there. So thank you very much.